Good. Well, I must congratulate you guys for attending this session because I think it's one of the more interactive ones. Well, it will be an interactive one, but it's more honed in on the internal, if you like, because I know that throughout the 2 days we've been speaking about the external environment and additional things related to the industry. What I'm going to say is it's value in, value out. I think in terms of the way we're going to move forward with this is it is meant to be interactive. We've got an excellent panel here with regards to supply chain distribution, consultancy, alliances, and also big pharma. I know we're still waiting for some people to come in. It's that. Okay. So, harmonizing practices and protocols for the pharma industry. This isn't my brainchild, but I inherited it recently with regards to helping the audience understand and obviously asking the panel questions in terms of where are our industries driving for efficiencies and effectiveness related to practices and protocols. What I want to try and get out of this session is obviously establishing governance frameworks. Are there people and organizations participating in effective management systems, especially related to quality and environmental health and safety? Is there much more focus on the standardization side of things? Because I know as a pharma player, we tend to go in and audit, but I feel that I should say, are there any regulators in the room, just to get a view of the perceptions from the regulatory side? I think in terms of myself, I feel like I'm always auditing or participating in an audit or running an audit, and it seems like the more and more we outsource and the more and more we collaborate, we tend to be doing the I's and T's on the auditing side. So the essence of today will be really about harmonization. What are the drivers, the benefits, costs, and the values attributed to that? My name is Hitesh Varambia. I'm currently working at UCB, looking after the Asia-Pac side of things for commercial quality. I will let the panel introduce themselves and give you an insight into their experiences and exposures and what they're currently up to. So, Axel, can I introduce you first?
Yeah, thanks. My name is Axel Sinner. I'm working for a management consulting company called Camelot. My experience is that especially the internal harmonization is very often lacking as pharma is a good industry building silos, and within silos you optimize and across silos you don't, and then you have a kind of problem of really harmonizing across processes, and therefore I think this is a very important topic to always consider, why harmonization is kind of bearing a value in it, or whether not, and these kind of question to really figure out in a company before starting any kind of severe activities.
Thank you.
I'm Sue Coote. I work for GlaxoSmithKline, and I look after outsourcing of our non-clinical activities, both to support discovery and the development side of our business. So I work extensively with sort of our external supply base, and I'm often struck. Not only do we build silos within our organisations, we have silos within our industry, and I think this gives rise to lots of duplication and potential for us to work more effectively together to take cost out.
So I'm Richard Holland. I'm the Operations Director at Pistoia Alliance. My personal background is in genomics and bioinformatics, but Pistoia Alliance is more of a member organisation made up of various different pharmaceutical companies and vendors in the life science space. And we run a series of projects that are intended to try and improve and increase innovation at the pre-competitive stage of R&D, so that all the different organisations can get together and collaborate and produce solutions that they can all standardise upon and benefit from, rather than each individually solving the same problems in-house.
Good afternoon. I'm Mike Meakin. I'm the VP for Quality and Regulatory Compliance in DHL Life Sciences, which is a special dedicated business operation within DHL. For the last 10 years, I've been responsible for that activity, and the main focus has been more on what I call GXP. So I'm more focused on GMP, GDP, type of activities, both internally and also approving suppliers and partners. But in addition to that, I also have a team of people who will undertake health and safety, environmental, BCM, and other types of quality system audits. And we do have a framework for how we've tried to approach that, which is much to do with the theme of this particular session.
Thank you. Just to channel and consolidate some of the elements, I think, in terms of what we're aiming to discuss and to get value. Does anyone actually have any questions at the moment that they'd like to ask the panel based on this session? Or shall I just help run through some of the high level? Does anyone have any questions at the moment? Okay. In terms of where we are, we're looking at harmonization. What are the drivers for the industry, the organizations, and what are the benefits in terms of industry versus the end user and the customer, but also in terms of having that company philosophy involved in cost reduction, and also looking at the administrative burden that we have to the external regulatory bodies that we serve, in addition to the patients. A lot of these things aren't factored in, and I think from next door's conversation, in addition to talking about Nespresso and other things alike, I think one of the key things was around the waste aspect. Building and harmonized a proactive approach, if you like, with regards to enhancing your abilities on quality systems and health and safety systems attributes the use of resources and additional costs. And I'm wondering, in terms of the panel, what kind of experiences you've had, whether you're dealing with clients from the consulting perspective, or whether you're dealing with alliances with regards to Pistoria, or from the big pharma perspective in terms of what your experiences and exposures have been. Let me just frame that as well in terms of the external requirements, looking at the compliance framework with regards to the expectations of the authorities and the governing bodies like GXP, FDA, EMA, environmental health and safety, as well as Japan and a few of the emerging sectors in terms of trying to do business in Russia and also in South America as well. I think internally, looking at the complexity of our organizations in terms of inhomogeneous structures across countries, local variation, looking at diversity and interpretation of master data management as well as clinical data management. So I'd like to open it up to Axel in terms of, from the consultative perspective, what you're seeing and some of the trends that you might be exposed to.
Well, first of all, I would like to differentiate a little bit in between the external requirements, where authorities are kind of coming across with some requirements we have to fulfill as pharma industry, which is then also depending on region or country or whatever, differentiated, and we have to fulfill it somehow. And the other would be procedures and harmonization of things which are not given from externally, but where we, as a pharma companies, then need to kind of trying to find the best way of either harmonizing or keeping things differentiated in a more complex way to run the business to an optimum. Looking at the external environment, I think you have the in development in the clinical part. You have a big initiative since I think 20 years going on, the ICH stuff, where I think there had been made over the years good progress to somehow harmonize and to make it at least somehow compatible and acceptable. On the other side, I see that also in the HTA, there's a lot of things going on which is still based on national findings, where also the authorities trying to assemble and see how they would like to handle that in the future. And I think there is probably a demand that where industry should also try to already as these kind of things are coming up, trying to interfere and try to steer a little bit in that kind of bodies and have an exchange and communication about what that means and how you can from the beginning on trying to get a better alignment across the different regions. Nevertheless, there is also from the other side, from regulatory or from the authority bodies, when we talk about HTA, there is of course always an interest to have something, a little piece that is different than somewhere else, because that is, first of all, also kind of justifying that this kind of national body is existing. And very often these national bodies have also this kind of steering tools by these kind of small differentiations. So you probably have experienced that whenever you have done something and try to get it approved by then a local authority, that they come up and say, but we need something on top of a standard, FDA standard, we need something on top, something special. And that is a way of trying to influence things and to have a lever on it. So you probably will not be able to completely harmonize something, because these kind of national authorities would then also feel not having any kind of influence anymore. So for industry, I think it's important to really find the right level of harmonization across these kind of regulations. And looking in the things where I feel that the most dynamic will come in is the HTA activities. And I also think that, which is currently driven quite heavily from the US, is a whole real world evidence story, because their kind of standards are kind of growing, coming up, are kind of driven by industry or by external consultants and these kind of things. So once the US standards are kind of establishing, also in terms of taking care of for example, privacy issues in the US, standards are established. And I think as an industry, you have to take care that we adapt it already kind of also to European standards, to have it aligned from the beginning, not establishing something and then having the problem that we can't use that, what we do in the US, in Europe anymore. So I think it is, for my experience, it is that we early up have to identify where are kind of new requirements coming up, and that we align that front up, especially when we on ourselves are kind of developing these kind of standards, because we want to use it to a certain extent. So this is, I think, the important part about these kind of external requirements.
Thank you, Axel. I'm wondering if, Sue, you want to contribute with regards to your experiences from Big Pharma?
I think when we're looking at external regulatory requirements, there's opportunities for sort of cross-industry collaboration, and I think it's important that we make the most of those. Oftentimes I think I see at an individual company level people essentially reinventing the wheel, and I think we've got to look for ways that we can collaborate more effectively in some of these sort of, I don't know, it's pre-competitive, it's really non-competitive type of arenas, so that we can actually work more effectively, lobby more effectively. And I think there were some interesting points yesterday raised around whether it actually requires an independent, if you like, outside of the industry to pull some of this together. But I think there's a lot of opportunity to simplify and to remove duplication.
I agree. I've got a question to the audience in terms of those of you who are service providers. Can you just put your hand up in terms of if you are? Okay. So what I'd like to understand is, given the fact that you have multiple clients and then therefore are accommodating multiple audits, inspections and discussions, do you have any experience in terms of looking at calibrating that and saying, actually, we have an in-house philosophy and policy that it's working across the board, rather than tailoring it for your Novartises or your GSKs or your Roches in that sense? Because I know that from my experience, having gone into numerous service providers, you're going in with the gold standard from the pharma perspective. Do you have any input into that as a service provider? Just wait. State your name and.
My name is Parthiban, and we have I'm working towards a startup in genomics and bioinformatics area. We are a little bit different service provider as opposed to others in this area. But when we go to an individual pharma company or something like that, they expect us to customize our services and products to them. And also there's like a whole area of regulatory and like audits and other things as well. Yeah. So as a startup, we don't have the infrastructure for anything other than like the actual stuff we are doing or we plan to do. But we expect us to kind of develop these capabilities in collaboration with our customers. Yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you. We have another question at the back.
Well,
So,
I just had a comment really as a service provider, so John Blamey from DHL, and what I'd raise is that maybe as service providers we're probably not overt enough about providing feedback. We probably take a little bit, you know, whatever you tell me I'll do. So we probably don't do enough of feeding back. And my analogy is when you're putting together a solution, rather than the car manufacturer's approach, which is I start from essentially a model and some things that I can customise, we generally start from the road. And actually I think we'd be at a much better end result if we started from a series of modules or whatever you want to term it. You can still customise, but you're customising from a point of view of I've got the basic shape and I'm then customising rather than from the ground up.
yeah. I appreciate that, thank you. I've heard a lot of examples from, you know, the use of the automotive industry, and one of the key fundamentals that I see is that they build quality in at the front, whereas within our industry we tend to be monitoring it at the other ends, and whether or not there's a lot of value add that we can take from that. I have a question for Mike down there in terms of, do you find that you need specialised or qualified auditors in terms of business systems, i.e. health and safety, looking at standards like 18001 and also the environmental standards for 14001. From your experience in terms of being able to conduct and award certain businesses of their management systems and processes, are you finding it that you need more and more specialised individuals within your arena?
Yeah, there's a number of things that you can do. I suppose it partly depends on the scope of the audits or the processes that you're going to undertake. So if you're just going to go and undertake an environmental audit or a health and safety type audit, yes, you would obviously ensure, you know, that audit team, if it had a lead auditor, they would definitely be a specialist. Or you might bring in subject matter experts to look at things. I mean, within DHL, where we'd undertake manufacturing type activities, you know, if we're having a look at clean rooms and look at that from an environmental, because we will do things like repackage cytotoxics. So, you know, that will have different sort of issues or challenges than maybe looking at a standard warehouse that's handling chemical products, or another facility that could be handling devices or even diagnostic specimens. So we basically handle the whole range of products. So if we're undertaking an audit, yeah, one of the first things we would do is ensure we've got specialists. One thing that we have tried a few years ago, if I take the whole DHL organisation, because we've got about 2,500 facilities worldwide, and in life sciences it's more specialist. We've probably got about 150 GXP facilities around the world in about 30 to 40 countries. But if we were undertaking a specific type of audit, we can either leverage from the experience, as you mentioned, because automotive is a sector of ours, as is technology, food, and all of the other industries, but we can work both at a silo level, so ensure that a good example, you could go and do this, and we learned this from customers. So if, as you put it, a Novartis, a Boehringer Ingelheim, a GSK, virtually everybody in either this room or at this event has probably audited us at somewhere in the world. And vice versa, we've audited virtually all of the suppliers, because in some countries we might partner with those, or vice versa. Yeah. So it's quite an incestuous relationship that we could be subcontracting to another, especially within the clinical trials area, another partner, and vice versa. In a country like Singapore or somewhere, you might find that one of those partners has subcontracted the clinical trials activity to DHL. So from that point of view, we would ensure that if it was related to a GXP, then the people would understand whether it was good clinical, good manufacturing, or good distribution practice. And then the bit that we tried to do a few years ago was, because of all of these ISO standards that you mentioned, they all sort of follow the same sort of framework. was, well, could you have a generalist who could cover all? And we have tried that. So everybody who works in my organisation is a registered order in environment, health and safety, so they are. The problem I found, and when I talk to our auditors, they prefer, so from a personal point of view, they prefer to play in a certain position most of the time. But if they were doing a particular type of audit, let's say they were doing a health and safety audit, or an environmental audit, and then they saw there was a lot of product that was overdue destruction, they might raise that. It's out of the scope of the audit, but they might say, well, there's a lot of expired stock and they're perhaps not clearing that stuff out. Equally, it could have an indirect effect. So that's one of the ways that we've tried to do it. But I'm sort of coming down more to, you do need specialists. The other way you can do it is within that team. You could have a lead auditor who may be a generalist or a specialist in one area, but then the other auditors on that team would have those skills.
Okay, thank you. I'm just thinking about the framework for standardisation and harmonisation. I mean, these elements aren't a competitive advantage or disadvantage. It's open source, as some people would like to say. There are standards established, therefore, should we not move away from this kind of silo mentality and look at the options of having some sort of overarching body or a governance procedure or something? I'm not sure what the panel think, but for me, you can't really capitalise on what it is.
No, I think
so. Therefore,
you're right.
Yeah.
I think the issue is, on the one hand, you don't want to put at risk and dilute the quality of the process, and that's one of the challenges that you've always got. I think where there are some wins, and I have heard it in a few of the other sessions, is we could all collaborate a lot better. So, for instance, there are organisations like RX360. So do we all have to audit? In some of our facilities, we have up to 80 manufacturers' products. So that could mean every week we're having an audit of a manufacturer. Now, you would think, could the industry, a bit like RX360, say, well, if Novartis have audited this particular facility this week, does GSK need to go next week, and does Boehringer or Pfizer or whoever have to go the following week? Maybe as an industry. Same with drug regulator audits. So you have in most countries, the drug regulators are coming in and the various notified bodies are coming in as well on almost an annual basis. So there are opportunities of working. Another area where I think it's not so much silo, but working more on a collaborative basis. There is a very large biotech company has come to us and said, well, you're specialists in the area. Why don't you, as part of your auditing your suppliers, audit, for instance, and we were asked to audit in Sub-Sahara, their suppliers, because they recognise all of our people are qualified. We do employ a lot of QPs and pharmacists in DHL, surprisingly. And we were able to deploy those people to actually undertake. So it's almost like we share the resources that we've got. So it's another area where at least you keep the focus. But coming back to the point, could we simplify? I think the answer is yes, as long as you don't compromise, the quality of the process and dilute it too much.
Okay. I do understand, and I'm just trying to think where to take the conversation, and I'm going to park that for the moment and come back, I think, with an answer. I want to involve Richard here because I want to understand from Richard's perspective and your organisation in terms of what you've been doing and working on in order to harmonise controlled substances within a regulatory compliance framework.
Okay, so controlled substances is like is GXP and everything else. It's something that every company has a responsibility to manage and audit itself to be compliant. And yet every company is doing the same thing, the same processes are carried out, the same rules are checked. So the Pistorius point of view is, can we somehow produce toolkits or data sets that would ease that process so everybody can have a standard common interpretation of the regulation, which is complex regulation, so that they have to spend less time trying to work out what the regulation means and more time actually just ticking boxes and ensuring they're compliant with it. And so we've achieved that so far for regulations in the UK, US and Switzerland. We're now up against the challenge of China. And it's proving particularly difficult because in China, to understand what's going on, you have to be, first of all, fluent in the relevant languages. You have to be a good legal mind and also a chemist to understand. The combination of those three and the ability to work with the Western pharma world is pretty rare. So we're actively now trying to find partners in China who can help us develop an additional data set to assist people like GSK and the UCB when they go into that market to remain compliant with it. Because it's not entirely clear always what compliance actually means. And that's just one area we were working in, and we're also working on what sounds totally irrelevant, but it's a notation system for complex molecules. But actually that's kind of interesting because we then talk to the FDA and see if we can adopt that as a standard for submitting molecular definitions as part of your drug submissions to the FDA. And if there's a standard method of describing them, therefore there's a standard method of understanding them, everybody's talking about the same language. All of this stuff is fairly low key.
I appreciate what you're saying, but I mean, in terms of everyone talking the same language, apart from the localization aspect in terms of country specific, everyone is following the framework.
Yeah.
However, if I was to say to you and take the analogy for Nespresso from next door, if I asked everyone in this room to develop an SOP on how to make tea, everyone would have a different SOP.
Yeah.
Just the same analogy from next door about how you like your coffee, I guess. But where I'm struggling is really to say, so should there be a framework in terms of harmonization around the interpretation of those standards or not, given the fact that everyone's speaking the same language?
I mean, ideally, the regulation should be consistent with itself.
Yeah.
You shouldn't need to be interpreting it, it should be clear.
True.
We would love to work with regulators to try and sort that out, but it's not an ideal world,
Yeah.
and so a common interpretation is the next best thing.
I mean, there was a very good example from the automotive industry with regards to Audi trying to launch their new model in the US, and the regulators didn't allow them to launch, but I think there was also a legislative aspect related to the LED lighting system that Audi have developed. It's innovative, groundbreaking, but they couldn't launch the model because the regulators didn't have a grasp on the technology and the understanding of what this new LED lighting system could achieve. And because of that, so there's an example from other parts of other industries where the regulators were not competent enough to judge the new technology coming on board. So I think in terms of speaking the same language, I do see a value add in this potential gap to create an organisation that would help build the bridges between the regulators and our industry and our organisation.
One thing we have come across is, as one has like mutual recognition processes across places like Europe, we found the same thing with drug regulators from different regions. And I'm presuming it must be the same with most manufacturers, but there's a particular area where we do contract manufacturing for a certain company where we take in their APIs and basically we pump out the finished products at the end of the process, but we export them out of Europe to the US, to Brazil, to Japan. So it's FDA approved, it's Anvisa approved, so the drug regulators from those countries have been and issued us their appropriate GMP certificates. But China, picking up on the point, wanted us also to do something, and because we were able to prove we had evidence of an US FDA audit and the other audits, they said, well, we're not going to bother coming to Europe to audit. They said, we'll be good enough to approve. Mm-hmm. Now I was quite taken back, but again, it's this sort of sharing collaboration that if one does have evidence and does have these relationships, and you tend to find now most drug regulators around the world are all talking to one another, mm-hmm. that can be leveraged, as long as you've got evidence that you've got a number of processes that have been approved to undertake that particular exercise. I don't know if there is other people who must have similar type of experiences, but that is one which we have been able to leverage.
Does anyone want to comment on any experiences from the audience, or no? Okay. I mean, in terms of the way I'm seeing it, the relationship of this discussion module into the strategically transforming pharma relationships is quite a valid one, on the basis that we're all trying to collaborate and work better and more effectively in terms of, and this is just a necessary evil, if you like, in a certain respect, because you need to be compliant and you need to be addressing it in the appropriate way. What I wanted to ask Axel is, in terms of, you know, what should a manager be considering and taking into account when you're trying to initiate some sort of an internal harmonization process, and then really when you're looking at that project, looking at the drivers, but also what are the kind of success factors?
Well, when we talk about this kind of internal harmonization, I think it's very important that whenever somebody's coming up saying, I have an issue here and I have an idea how we should harmonize, that he early up starts really talking across his silo and really checks who else is a kind of stakeholder of that procedure he wants to modify. I have seen poor examples where somebody started out very engaged with a very positive mindset on changing something, and pushed that quite far, but did not include the other functions or other countries and so on, and it ended up more or less in a kind of disaster, because what this one thought he could optimize in his area of responsibility would really create even larger problems somewhere else. And of course the managers in these other areas would fight back quite hard. So whenever you start these kind of activities of harmonizing something, I think it's very important that you try to get a clue about who is affected by that process else, that you get a kind of informal talk with these people before you start a project out of it, and talk with these people and try to get contact, talk about your ideas first, and see whether there is a kind of useful response to it. And once this is kind of clarified, it is very important to really, when you start an initiative there, really to get all stakeholders on board from the beginning, because otherwise you will kill the project before you even start. I think that's very important. Another point somebody really should have a look on is always these kind of complexity which you want to harmonize, which you want to reduce in that sense, whether there is not a kind of value behind. What does it mean? Either a value can be that a customer is paying for something, which we do differentiated, or that it reduces on some other point in the company costs. So for example, I just remember that the guy from Catalan said, well, all our production facilities are FDA approved. So is that the right way of saying, well, whenever in a company everything should be on the highest standard, which is FDA approved, is that the right way? It could be that, for example, that you have facilities that exclusively produce for the EU markets. So would it make sense then to suggest that these kind of facilities, which are not second source for FDA areas or whatever, that they are on this kind of high documentation level like FDA approval, or should be the EMEA level, right? And the clear answer is yes, it should be differentiated, because you save a lot of costs. Because the FDA standard is much more expensive to operate. So I think it is always very good to understand, is there a kind of value behind of harmonizing, or is there a value behind having something differentiated? Also, when you talk about processes, you sometimes have very high complicated products where you need a high standard in your processes, which are expensive to handle, of course. So should that be the standard then for each and every product? Or would you say, no, we probably better have 3 different kind of processes which are differentiated, so that we only have to apply the very expensive process for the product really that needed, and the others we can run on a lower level. So very important when talking about this kind of complexity is to really understand front up what is really the value, what creates the value. And as long as you haven't done this kind of analytics, you shouldn't go to top management and try to start an initiative, because this is going to be a boomerang then.
Thank you.
I think we've heard a lot about how one size doesn't necessarily fit all, and I think what Axel's just articulated is a good example of that. So I think you wouldn't necessarily advocate a single global standard where you're meeting the highest possible requirements, but even beyond that, if we're looking at different regional requirements or in-country requirements, China specifically maybe, I still think there are opportunities to collaborate with across the industry so that we develop common understanding of local solutions to meet specific requirements rather than perhaps each reinventing the wheel. And I guess I'm struck with the question is, it seems logical that we should do that, so what is it that's stopping us?
I agree.
It's interesting on the medical device side of things. That industry, it used to be the GHTF, it's now the IMDRF. All of the regulations that then go into the regulators actually come out of the industry. So you would basically get all of the pharmacos together and they work and they come up with the recommendations on how to audit, and they'll have study group papers. I don't know if that's a good model, maybe just picking that up, how as a group we could almost have like an industry standard for doing it. And then you start to get synergies that if we're going to audit a biologics facility, then these are the key things that we need to do. We don't have to worry about, some of these other issues. But that is something which I see, because sort of like my role sort of spread between the two industries. I do notice the med devices industry does seem to work well with those forums. I suppose there are similar forums with other things like FPR or other, or some of the animal health type groups. But the subtle difference I notice is that they do seem to specialise on some of these sort of regulatory audit type processes.
I mean, I'm welcoming the fact that everyone's aligned, saying yes, we do have a need to standardise and to go forward with the approach. So I guess the question is around what level of senior management contribution, or in terms of what are the cases for the enablers for senior management to throw resources at this in terms of establishing a standardised framework or allowing you to do that. Because at the moment I don't see the connect for the silos that exist, because everyone, and to take the point on from next door about waste, you've got here 4 or 5 people doing the same thing with the same, there's got to be some sort of a driver behind that. And I think senior management need to be supporting this and driving this, and maybe opening it up to saying, what is it that is required to enable that to happen?
And the problem with any kind of standards is there's always more than one standard. You see this a lot in, a very technical example, but in the R&D IT sector, there's scientific workflow software. People, sequence a sequence of tasks and they need them executed in a certain way. And there are about 20 different standard ways of representing and executing those workflows. And nobody can understand or agree on a single representation that everybody can then use to publish their work and understand what each other's done. And that's been a problem for 20, 30 years, and it's a problem that's shared with academia as well as industry, and it's never been solved. So I think it's a very great ideal to develop a single standard for everybody to adhere to, but in practice, there's always going to be somebody that goes, oh, that doesn't apply to me because it doesn't cover my specific use case or my specific problem, and they'll go off and do their own one. And that's very tricky. And it's hard enough between 2 companies, but multiple silos within a single company can have exactly the same problem.
No, I take your point on standardization. I think there was a saying at one point, how does Bill Gates change a light bulb? He doesn't. He just changes the standard and redefines. So I think in terms of, where we're going with this is, how does this then link into strategically transforming pharma relationships? As I said, we've got 5 resources here that are doing the same level of activities, yet we're potentially not talking to each other, apart from the fact that we're sat around this forum to discuss that very fact. So I don't know if anyone wants to contribute, Axel, from your consultative experience, whether you've seen it.
No, you can see this kind of harmonization in many things. Something which is going on in the last, let's say, 3 years, it's getting more hotter in the industry, is, for example, master data management. You find that in every company. Just remembering what was said about acquisitions in one of the other panels. How many acquisitions had been gone on, and then you find that you have within your own company a huge, I would call it a kind of puzzle of different sets of data for the same thing, and to work that out, really to come down and kind of harmonizing, it's a real big effort. You have to standardize your systems where you handle these kind of data. You have to do this kind of transfer, how you transfer the data from A to B, which is then the standard. You have to come up with a kind of organization that is really taking care of the governance in the future. You have to define front up all the principles, how you want to harmonize. I mean, that is very important also for other areas. Once you want to harmonize, get clear about the principles you want to apply. If this is not clear, you will end up in an endless discussion. So make that clear at the beginning. So I think there are a lot of things where you can harmonize in a company, especially when it's about internal things, because you have the freedom to do so. On the other side, you have to be always clear that you have to make up your case until the management is kind of picking up on it. So usually it's about either value creation or cost reduction. Something like that must be in, otherwise you don't get resources for it. And the other thing is once you made your business case and got top management involved, you have to have a kind of clue how you want to organize that kind of project, because it needs to come from headquarter level, because otherwise you don't get the other countries, the other silos not involved. So it needs to be really initiated that way. And for that, you should have a kind of clue how you set up this kind of project, because when you end up with a CEO saying, "Oh, great with your project, with your approach of harmonizing, go ahead," but you don't have a clue how to do that, then you have a problem, because then the CEO expects a kind of we have achieved our goal sometimes, and if you don't have a clue how to handle these things, then it's going to be tough. So it is important, really, what I already said at the beginning, this kind of buy-in of people in the other function silos, countries or whatever, that you want to drive something and try to get an input how other people think about it. And out of this you can then probably develop a kind of program. How would you like to set up the structure for a harmonizing project?
Mm-hmm. I mean, there were some good points that came across in today's discussions. One of the things was from Mathieu Olep, who said that she was proud of the European regulatory framework. And had Cornel Stelmaran been in this, I would have asked him how they managed to harmonize a lot of the QA functions, given the fact that they had to go through this very exercise for Catalent. The way I'm seeing it is really for the service providers to be a bit more vocal about saying, hey, Mr. Novartis, Mr. Pfizer, Mr. GSK, you've got to take on board the fact that, well, we've got these systems and models in place that work for us and it's accepted by those other parties, and educate maybe some of the clients in that respect. I don't know what, Mike, you think with regards to that in terms of channeling the discussion when it comes to...
I suppose one of the things that I've just picked up from what you've said is that the EMA licenses and handles everything as one unit across Europe, doesn't it? Whereas with other products, you might, depending on whether you try to take a decentralized approach or a centralized approach to getting your medicines to market, there is a different structure. But maybe what that identifies is we are better off with maybe larger organizations rather than lots of individual country. And that's really the point. So I think, yeah, absolutely, because I've not really heard a bad thing said so much about dealing through the EMA. But if you talk about each of the country DRAs, you hear lots of issues are like, or countries will have a tactic. They'll go to France first to get the drug approved, and then they'll go to another country. So, and then once they get maybe a mutual recognition approach, they then can sort of tactically get their products. But it is a very good
I
point.
agree. I think it is to do with a confidence level. I mean, I've got an experience that I will share with regards to the MHRA in terms of the way they audited a big pharma versus a generics, and it wasn't with the same due diligence. You think, but then you can then talk about the individual auditors and their preferences and their strengths and where they would like to go with their understanding of what they're auditing and everything else. But I think, there is that, and there shouldn't be a worry or how would you say, some sort of cautiousness around approaching those governing bodies about saying, hey, Ima, I've got a fantastic idea, this is how we'd like to work, or saying, excuse me, Mr. FDA, we'd like to approach you on this. And that would, because I mean, ICH harmonization, for me, it's been going on for years. I mean, I'd be interested in understanding, in terms of the audience, your experiences dealing with regulators. If you do, I mean, there's no auditors, I remember. No one put their hand up. So just wondering if anyone has any examples that they would like to share, or if you have any questions for the panel.
No, but I mean, we're talking about a lot on auditors. On the other side, it is that these kind of regulatory bodies are responsible, and they are really responsible. Not just, I mean, they're not just doing it for the purpose of getting us kidding or something like that. I have worked at a company that had been very prominent where something failed in the past. That had been Grünenthal with Contergan, where when you have worked for a company like that nowadays, you realize why certain safety for the patients is so important, because you still meet these people, they still suffer from it, and so on. And it was a real big disaster. And God thanks, it's not happening in that amount anymore because of regulations, because of authorities trying to make the things safer. So it's not just something which is there and nobody knows why. There is a reason behind. It is about patient safety. So I think it is important then to understand also that auditors, that these kind of authorities, they also have to stand in for what they do. Because if something is happening and they did audit, and it turns out something was missed there or something, and anything created out of that, they have to. I mean, they lose their jobs. They are responsible for that too. So it is, I think, important to see auditing not just as a burden, but also as a safety for you as a company. Because I can tell you, Grünenthal was a very small company at that time. It still pays for that. It has a tremendous poor reputation. The family owning that company has a very poor reputation, and so on. So these kind of effects you don't want to have, really. And sometimes in our daily life we tend to forget that. And I think once we deal with the topic of harmonization of these kind of regulatory processes, I think we should always come back to the point saying how to do it in the best way for the patients.
I think it's a good point, because I do wonder whether sort of like the inherently risk-adverse nature of the industry means that we do all feel we need to go and look ourselves. Yeah. There's a lack of trust almost, if you like, in bodies taking on some of these sorts of accountabilities on behalf of a number of companies.
It's a good point too. I think from the conversation next door regarding whether you would trust what you read and see on the internet versus what a physician would tell you comes into play here, because at the end of the day, if I'm telling you I've audited a site and based on credential, background, whatever, you should be able to trust my judgment on that, as we do from the external perspective. So I think it is something to consider and to play on to move forward. But as I say, I think in terms of coaching and communicating, I think the external service providers that exist have much more of a leading role, if you like, with regards to coaching and nurturing. And it is that. It's, the fact is that you could have an individual that's worked for 3 or 4 different big pharma companies, whether or not then they won't, because it's the same individual. Do you know what I mean? So technically, this is not a competitive IP technology or anything else, and there should be more collaboration. So I'll be interested in understanding how we will, continue to contribute at the same level of influence, because I think the conference kicked off with that in terms of the momentum our industry has and where it's going. And I think also looking at how we will collaborate closely and find new ways of working together. We've got about 2.5 minutes. I do appreciate there's a coffee session after this, so I'm just wondering if there's any final thoughts from the panel, and whether or not there's any final thoughts from the audience before we wrap up. Have we got the microphone? Thank you.
So we've discussed a lot about the existing issues and audits and regulatory issues. For emerging technologies, for new scientific breakthroughs to enter into these practices, then this requires new regulations, new changes in. So do you think it's a hurdle now for emerging technologies to get into the space just because the regulatory approvals are very difficult to?
Well, my experience is, and I think I can talk about that currently about European bodies. We have seen throughout changes in terms of interacting the HTA business much closer with industry in terms of early up consultations, discussing topics and so on. That also the other regulatory bodies like the EMA, giving the market authorization, got pretty much under pressure of looking, there's a regulatory body that is talking much more with these guys, and it's like kind of service and interface that also the other regulatory bodies are kind of making a kind of mental change, to my experience, saying, we get also more open for early consultations, come to us early up and so on. And I think it is then very important for the industry when they come up with new technologies, that they early up come up with a kind of request for consultation. Yeah? Not just the day before they want to submit, because you have to allow also the authorities to learn and think about how they will handle. But at the end, the authorities are doing all these to secure the safety for the patients. And of course, if something comes up new, which can't be captured by existing rules, they are also interested to develop that for the safety of the patient. So I would not see the regulators there as the enemies, not to talk, and then just come for the final fight once and then lose. I would say it should be something like a partnership, especially where you have to develop things, and you should be also well prepared really to have a kind of differentiated offer. Because if you only walk in there with that's a solution we suggest, and they have any kind of concern about that, you're hooked up. So it's a kind of process where you offer different variations and give also maybe your preferred to it, but keep it a little bit an open dialogue, which should be well prepared front up. That is important.
Thank you, Axel. I think we're out of time now, but I think your last sentence there really sums it up in terms of when you're looking at collaboration, communication, and just being transparent about that, especially with the regulatory bodies in terms of, I agree with you, they are very welcoming of new ideas and new suggestions and things, because innovation is the key to that. And the fact is that if you're upfront and honest and communicating with them, you should reap the rewards further down the line, because they are on board at the beginning and they appreciate what you're trying to do. You will never be, how would you say, you'll never be punished for asking a question, even if it's not in the relevant context to which the industry and the regulators are. But patient safety is key. So thank you, Axel.
And just one comment. And if you do it early enough with not a fixed concept, because I was talking on on one of the other boards when it was about regulation, I said, well, sometimes regulation is on our own heads and blocking us for innovation. So the answer was then, yeah, and then we talked and we got a no, and end of the story. That is typically happen when you come very late. Then a no is a no. If you come very early with, let's say, open ideas and giving the authorities also the chance to think about it and find a solution, I think then you will not end up with a no. Then you will end up somehow with a solution that somehow works out.
Great, thank you. That's it, I guess. Thank you very much for your contributions and your participation. It's been fruitful from my experiences, and I wish you, we have one more session, so I would say wish you a safe journey home, but let's see what happens next door. Thank you, everyone.